You wake up. Your country's biggest bank isn't down. It's been frozen. Not by hackers. Not by a market crash. Frozen by a government 8,000 miles away. No warning. No due process. Just gone. That scenario? It just became real. The US Treasury has issued a chilling message to the global financial system. If you even touch Chinese trades linked to Iranian oil, even if the deal's clean, even if it's paid in Chinese yuan, you could be locked out of the entire US financial network. SWIFT, dollar clearing, Wall Street, all of it cut. Not a theory, a threat, one that's already being enforced. In April 2025, behind sealed doors in Hong Kong, top US Treasury officials didn't come to negotiate. They came to deliver what experts are calling one of the most aggressive financial ultimatums in modern history. Their message was blunt. If oil tied to Iran ends up in China, if the money moves through your bank, if it's priced in yuan, you could be cut off from the global financial bloodstream the US still controls. 2 weeks later, the message became action. 9 Hong Kong-based entities sanctioned. Their crime? Allegedly pushing oil money through forged shipping records tied to Iran's Revolutionary Guard. But this wasn't just about enforcement. It was a shot across the bow to everyone. Because here's the twist. Nearly all of Iran's oil exports, 91%, now flow to China. Over 1 million barrels a day. And they're not priced in dollars. They're bought with Chinese yuan. Quietly. Systematically. Outside the dollar's shadow. This isn't just sanctions. This is a war against a system being built in real time. A parallel financial universe where the dollar doesn't rule. A world that's getting faster, smarter, more defiant. And Hong Kong? It's the new battlefield. Banks like HSBC, Bank of China, and others have been told by Washington, ignore the shell companies. Go deeper. Find the ultimate owners. Identify anyone, anywhere moving Iranian oil money in yuan. Why does that matter? Because these aren't side players. Hong Kong now clears more than $260 billion in cross-border trades. And for the first time ever, over 54% of those are settled in yuan. The dollar just lost its crown in Asia's financial capital. And that's not a trend. That's a signal. What the US is demanding now goes beyond borders. It's demanding compliance from institutions outside its jurisdiction. Foreign banks being told to enforce American law or else. As Max Maish from the FDD puts it, this isn't regulation. It's financial coercion. So what happens if they refuse? What if they side with Beijing's fast-expanding yuan-based financial infrastructure? That's when this stops being economic pressure and becomes a currency war. Because China's oil game is decades in the making. In 2021, it signed a sprawling cooperation pact with Iran. Locked in discounts, added risk premiums, secured guaranteed supply, all paid for in yuan. And it didn't stop there. China is building out the pipelines, the clearinghouses, the digital rails to make sure that system keeps growing, with or without the dollar. And now, thanks to US sanctions, it's growing faster. By March 2025, yuan-based cross-border transactions soared to $725 billion, up 22% from the year before. Bloomberg shows yuan now accounts for over 4.1% of global payment value. That might sound small, until you remember, it was under 1% just a few years ago. This isn't a side door. It's a new front door. And Washington? It might be slamming its own shut. Because while it's busy weaponizing access to the dollar, the domestic economy is already creaking. US consumer sentiment as of April 2025 is cratering, second lowest since records began. Inflation expectations just hit 5.6%, the highest since 1981. Retail margins fell 1.6% in just 1 month, the sharpest drop in over a decade. Costs are spiking. Steel imports, up 25% year over year. Companies aren't passing prices on to consumers anymore. They're absorbing the hit, quietly bleeding. And it's not new. Since 2023, retail profits have fallen in 15 out of 17 months. This isn't a market ready to boom. This is a market gasping for air. So if the whole case for bringing manufacturing back to America, the reshoring dream, depends on strong consumers, what happens when that pillar cracks? And just as the pressure builds, the administration introduces its grand fix, the One Big Beautiful Bill. A promise to lock in the 2017 tax cuts. But buried in the fine print? A loaded clause, retaliation. If any foreign country imposes what the US decides is unfair tax treatment on an American firm, Washington will strike back. Hard. With a 5-point hike in taxes on US-sourced income of foreign companies. And a jump in the withholding tax on outbound payments, from 10% to 12.5%. Who decides what's unfair? The White House. No definitions. No oversight, just raw discretion. The CBO confirms the numbers. The Tax Foundation estimates a potential $91 billion annual drop in foreign investment. The irony? This retaliation mechanism could blow up the very reshoring agenda it claims to support, because what scares manufacturers most isn't tax. It's volatility, it's unpredictability, it's retaliation cycles that make long-term planning impossible. Treasury Secretary Besson stood before Congress and insisted the bill would stabilize debt-to-GDP ratios. But early projections from the Joint Committee on Taxation? They show rising deficits in multiple brackets. So what do you get when you mix financial ultimatums, retaliatory taxation, rising consumer instability, and a weakening grip on global trade? You get exactly what Washington is trying to avoid. A world where the U.S., in trying to defend the dollar's dominance, ends up accelerating its decline. A world that stops waiting and starts building a system of its own. What was supposed to turn America into a magnet for global investment might now be driving capital away. On paper, secondary sanctions are described as sharp, targeted tools, surgical even. But in reality, they often land more like explosives. The U.S. Treasury warns that any foreign institution facilitating sanctioned transactions, particularly oil trades between Iran and China, often routed through yuan-based payments, risks losing access to dollar clearing systems. That threat, however, isn't curbing the behavior. It's accelerating a shift Washington has long feared. China is at the center of this transformation. In March 2025, the People's Bank of China reported cross-border renminbi transactions hit nearly $725 billion, making up over 54% of the country's global trade. Just 3 years ago, that figure was 36%. SWIFT now ranks the yuan as the fourth most used global currency, with a 4.12% share of global payment value, a record high. Beijing isn't just reacting economically, it's moving strategically. In April, Chinese authorities rolled out new incentives for state-owned enterprises to settle international contracts in yuan exclusively. This pivot isn't isolated. China's deputy central bank governor recently described the global trade system as blocked and criticized tariff walls for distorting the economic cycle. In a twist of irony, U.S. sanctions designed to isolate adversaries like Iran and China may actually be showing the rest of the world how to sidestep the dollar. If the dollar is no longer the default, what replaces it? Consider a Japanese automaker operating in the U.S. It sees strong sales, solid profits, until it converts revenue back to yen. In 2025 alone, the dollar has dropped 8.1% against the yen, wiping out margins for foreign manufacturers exporting from American soil. At the same time, the U.S. is pushing for a 5-point corporate tax increase on foreign companies, along with new withholding taxes on outbound payments. According to the Tax Foundation, those changes could drive away as much as $91 billion in annual foreign direct investment. Add to that a cooling labor market. April data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows manufacturing job growth has stalled. Real wages fell 0.3% quarter over quarter. Regulatory uncertainty isn't helping either. Tariffs swing wildly, 10% one month, 30% the next, then back again. Foreign firms now face a constantly shifting landscape. Some are pulling back altogether. Bloomberg reports that 246 major U.S. companies have declared bankruptcy this year, the highest number in over a decade. America's effort to control global capital isn't reinforcing its dominance. It's prompting capital to flee. The trade strategy, especially under Trump, is built on economic pressure. But without consistency, that pressure turns into volatility. Since January, tariffs on Chinese goods have fluctuated between 10% and 30%. A Bloomberg survey of global fund managers suggests they'll remain elevated through the end of the year. Unsurprisingly, Chinese exports to the U.S. have dipped, and China's industrial output has cooled. April's growth came in at 5.9%, down from 7.7% just a month prior. But it's not just the scale of tariffs or sanctions that rattles investors. It's the unpredictability. As Sam Joachim of EFG Asset Management points out, Trump's first term should be a case study. Deals can unravel, and no agreement feels permanent. Businesses aren't just planning around policy, they're bracing for chaos. Retailers rush to stock inventory ahead of tariff hikes, spiking their costs. Manufacturers hit pause on expansion, unsure what rules would govern them 6 months out. Even when a tariff truce was announced in May, the response was tepid. Because the deeper issue isn't confrontation, it's confusion. And in this environment, no board is greenlighting billion-dollar bets. Sanctioning oil exports is one thing, but targeting entire banking ecosystems is something else. In May, the U.S. blacklisted 9 Hong Kong-based non-bank firms accused of obscuring Iranian oil origins. Treasury officials also met with top banks in Singapore, Malaysia, and Hong Kong, pressuring them to probe non-dollar trades tied to these flows, often through shell companies connected to Chinese buyers. Analysts like Max Masick from the Foundation for Defensive Democracies argue that a tougher stance would be to directly sanction the banks themselves. But doing so could spark serious global financial fallout. Many of these institutions are integrated into the Western financial system, with branches in the US and Europe. Cutting them off from dollar networks risks systemic shock. While Washington flexes, China builds. In April, Beijing expanded pilot programs using its digital currency, the ECNY, for trade in Southeast Asia, bypassing dollar intermediaries entirely. In trying to weaponize access to the dollar system, the US may be showing the world exactly how to build a financial system that no longer depends on it. America's financial supremacy was never just about economics. It was about trust, that access to US markets, banking rails, and legal protections would be stable, rules-based, and reciprocal. But when even close allies and long-term trade partners start questioning whether that trust still holds, the system begins to fray. The more America uses the dollar as leverage, the more the world begins to explore alternatives. China isn't countering with missiles or warships. It's countering with spreadsheets, smart contracts, and trade incentives, and plenty of countries are listening. Which brings us to the bigger question. If this fragile financial order does break apart, under sanctions, tariffs, and chronic uncertainty, what comes next? Who gets to rewrite the rules of the game? And will the next global reserve currency be governed by market trust or political force? What do you think? Has the US gone too far, or is this the only way to protect its influence in a rapidly shifting world? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you found this breakdown valuable, give it a like, hit subscribe, and check out another video now playing on your screen.